Hey everyone, welcome back. My name is Bianca. I'm a customer success engineer here at Prefect, and this is module 103 of PAL. If you haven't watched 101 and 102, I would recommend doing that first before proceeding with the rest of this session so that you are well prepared for the material that we're going to cover here. If you want to follow along, the examples will be linked in the GitHub repository that is either down below in the description of this video if you're watching on YouTube, or if you have a Prefect engineer that is guiding you through the PAL program, they will be sure to send over the link to the repository that has all of the fun examples that you can run at home in your own environment. And that'll be good for the lab, which is going to be at the end of this video. With that, let's go. Here is the agenda for Module 103. We're going to cover some topics that will show us how to work with data and save time and money with Prefect. We're going to learn how to save results, leverage caching, and create artifacts to communicate insights from our pipelines to our team members. We're going to learn a little bit more about user management and a bunch of the features that are specific to Prefect Cloud. We're also going to learn how to set up automatic notifications for workflow states. First topic on the list is results. What are results? Results are data returned by a flow or task. In this case, this task is returning 1, so 1 is the result. You can pass results fairly easily in Prefect from one task to another, and doing so will inform Prefect of data dependency relationships at runtime. So here is a snippet of code from the previous example that we explored in more depth in the previous modules. This is our fetch weather function. We're passing the output of the fetch weather function as input to the save weather function. By default, Prefect returns a result that is not persisted to disk. It's only stored in memory. You can persist results by using the persist result argument and applying it to the decorator as you see here. So you have to set that value to true, and then the result will be persisted. All persisted results are stored in the .prefect storage folder by default. They're also pickled, but you can use any other serializer or method for compression that you would like to use. Let's say you want to leverage cloud storage to store results from your pipelines. Well, you can absolutely do that. In this example here, you can see that we are setting the flows result storage to a GCS bucket. Specifically, we are loading in a GCS bucket block that has all of our bucket configuration stored inside of it. So whenever this flow runs, the results will be stored in the GCS bucket. Here are a few things to take into consideration with working with big data. So it's recommended that you read and write data to a cloud provider without passing the data around from task to task. So if you're working with fairly large data frames, to spare your execution environment, I would recommend reading and writing those data frames to S3 bucket or some sort of external storage system. There are a ton of tips that can be found in the docs. There is a whole guide for working with big data, so I would recommend checking out that documentation if that's what you intend to do with Prefect. Moving right along to our next topic, caching. So, what is caching? Caching is a Prefect feature that allows you to reuse the results from previous task runs. Why exactly would you want to do that? Well, let's say the input for a particular task isn't really expected to change from flow run to flow run. Well, if it's a computationally expensive task to run, then it would be of interest to not needlessly re-execute the task with the same inputs over and over again, and rather just reuse the previous results if the inputs haven't changed. At least that's one example, is to save on execution costs. Caching is applicable to tasks only in Prefect, and it requires result persistence in order to be used. Now, there are a variety of different cache policies that you can pick and choose from, and cache policies inform Prefect how to construct cache keys. There is an inputs cache policy, which specifically only reruns the task if the inputs change. So if the task is provided different inputs, then it will rerun with the new inputs rather than just using the old results and throwing a completed state. So you can see here in this example, we are calling the task 3 separate times. The first time around, the task will run. The input doesn't change in the second run, it's still 8. So the task will not run, it'll just use the previously cached result. In the last run, because the input has changed and our cache policy is inputs, the task will execute with the new inputs. Here you can see the logs from running that example in the previous slide. So you can see the first execution of the task, the result is printed out in the logs. When the task is rerun with the same inputs, it'll just return that cached state, so that completed state that the arrow is pointing to. And then once the input is changed, you can see that the task runs again and a new result is returned. If you delete the cached result in that storage folder and then rerun the flow, the task will run because there's no record of that cached result being retained anywhere. Beyond the inputs policy option that we explored in the previous slide, you can see that there is a variety of different policy options to pick and choose from. So there's default, inputs, task source, and flow parameters. Beyond setting the cache policy, you can also define a cache expiration. Here you can see an example of just that. So we are using the inputs cache policy for this task, and we are also setting an expiration of 1 minute. So once that expiration time elapses, then the cache will essentially be refreshed and the previously cached results will not be used because they're expired, and then the task will run the next time this flow is called. Now let's talk a little bit about transaction rollbacks. What are transactions in Prefect? Transactions allow you to roll back a side effect if code fails. You can kind of think of it as an undo button to return to the previous state before the code even executed. And you can learn more about them in the docs. We're going to walk through an example of how to use transactions in the next couple slides. In a flow, you can call tasks using a with transaction context block. As you can see here, we have a transaction block where we are writing a file and then conducting a quality test. You can also specify an action to take if an error is raised in your code. So you can see here that we have defined an on rollback hook, and we are going to delete the data file if the data quality check is not passed. Here's everything put together. You can see the write file task at the top that's creating that side effect text file. There is the on rollback hook down below it, which is responsible for deleting the file. You have the quality test, which checks the contents of the file. And in the event that this quality test fails, then the on rollback hook will be queued up and the data file will be deleted. And all of this is being handled within that transaction block down below in the flow. Transactions at most go through 4 different phases in their life cycle. There's a beginning stage, a stage, a rollback stage, and then last but not least, a commit stage. Next, let's talk a little bit about artifacts. What are artifacts good for? Artifacts communicate with team members through persisted outputs such as markdown, tables, images, and links. So you can think of them as a great way of showing the results of your pipelines or information about your pipelines to other members of your team in a human legible format. They're meant for human consumption, and a few examples of what artifacts could be are model scores, data quality checks, and reports. They're stored in the Prefect database and shown in the UI, so they're persisted, and there is an option to limit user access to them, but that is on a paid tier of Prefect Cloud specifically. Here is an example of how to generate a markdown report from a Prefect task. You can find examples of generating artifacts in the 103 folder of the GitHub repository for the course. So as you can see here, we are creating a little weather report, and it is going to take into account the time and temperature. Artifacts can be accessed directly from the run's timeline. So whenever you kick off a flow run that generates an artifact, you will be able to see that artifact when you go to the flow run page. And here is that very same weather report that we generated in the previous slide, and it is presented in the Prefect UI as a nice little table. One nice thing about artifacts is that they are versioned, so you can see how an artifact is updated over time from flow run to flow run. Now let's talk about some Prefect Cloud specific features. If you recall from Module 101, Prefect Cloud is an alternative to hosting your own Prefect server, so it pretty much offloads that whole responsibility to, well, the Prefect team instead of having to do that yourselves. It comes with user account management at some of the higher tiers and includes workspaces, service accounts, role-based access control, SSO, and audit logs. And there are a few additional features as well that are exclusive to Prefect Cloud that we'll cover soon. Let's talk a little bit about workspaces. I'd mentioned previously that workspaces are essentially walled environments inside of a larger Prefect account. One reason that folks would want to have multiple workspaces is to have mirrored environments. So a workspace for development, one for staging, and one for production. Alternatively, workspaces can be split between teams, so one team can have access to one workspace so that their work is separated. Since there is a concept of a user in Prefect Cloud, which is absent from the open source server, users can have a variety of different roles at the account level and at the workspace level, each with their own sets of permissions. Another Prefect Cloud specific feature is error summaries by Marvin AI. This feature is enabled by default. However, if you want to disable it, you can go into your account settings and toggle it off. As for what these error summaries look like, let's say you have a failed flow. Well, without even having to dive into the logs, you can see a short summary of why the flow might have failed, and that is generated by the Marvin AI feature. And you can see here that there are 2 flows that failed, and there are summaries for the potential reasons why either of these pipelines have failed. Now let's talk a little bit about events. What are events in Prefect? They are a record of what has happened inside or potentially even outside of your Prefect ecosystem. They can represent API calls, state transitions of workflows, and changes in the overall environment. There is an event page where you can inspect all of the events that have occurred in your Prefect server. This is applicable to Cloud and OSS as well, events were actually open sourced in Prefect 3.0, so you should be able to inspect events in the events page, whether you're using Prefect Cloud or Prefect Open Source Server. Events power a lot of Prefect features under the hood. That includes flow run logs, audit logs, and automations. And speaking of automations, let's take a look at them. What are automations in Prefect? They are a flexible framework that allows you to take action in response to events that are happening in your Prefect environment. In short, if a trigger happens, do some sort of action in response, and even if something doesn't happen that we expected to happen in a certain time period, then we'll want to take some kind of action in response. Here are some examples of automations. So let's say if a flow run that's tagged with a production tag fails, I want to be alerted of that, so send an email. If a data quality check fails, then I would like to run a separate deployment to fetch more data. And if a work pool changes to a not ready state, which means something about the infrastructure has gone awry, I would like to call a webhook to kick off some other process. Let's explore this notification automation a little bit more. So you can send an email when a flow run fails with an automation. The trigger in this case is the flow run failing, and then the action is to send an email in response. Here you can see the form for creating an automation. So you can specify the trigger type. In this case, it is the flow run state, although there are a ton of different trigger options to pick and choose from. And down below, you have the option to select the flows that you would like to monitor specifically. By default, it's all flows, but you can filter this down however you would like. And we are looking for this flow run to enter a particular state. Once the conditions of the trigger are met, then we can set the action. So this is the part of the form where we're defining that action to send the email alert. Once you have defined the action, you can go ahead and save your automation, and then from there on out, you'll receive an email whenever a flow run fails. If you want to disable the automation, you can. All you need to do is toggle them on and off. Beyond just getting email notifications, there are a ton of notification options for you to pick and choose from. There's Slack, Microsoft Teams, PagerDuty, just a bunch. And to set these up, generally you'll need to create a notification block in the Prefect UI to leverage in your automation. Okay, that brings us to the end of 103. Let's do a quick little recap of what we covered. We talked a little bit about working with data. We talked about Prefect Cloud and some of the features that are specific to Prefect Cloud. We talked a little bit about the event system and automations. Now we're ready to take a look at the lab for this module. Here are the instructions for the 103 lab. For some of these, you will need to have your Prefect Cloud account open so that you can interact with the UI. So for the first step in the UI, make an email automation that fires when the flow run is complete. Then toggle the automation off from the UI. You can go ahead and check out the event feed in the UI from the events page, and then create a markdown artifact that prints a weather forecast in a nice little table. You can check out the 103 folder to find an example of how to do that if you get stuck. Once you complete all of these steps, you can give the stretch goals a try. You can create a flow that contains a task that uses caching, and then change the cache policy and inspect how the task run behavior changes. All right, I am excited to get started with the 103 lab with all of you. First, let's explore how we can create an artifact using a Prefect flow. And then later, we can try and set up an automation that lets us know whenever this particular flow completes. So the example that I have pulled up here actually just does just that. It creates a markdown artifact. And here you can see that we're importing from Prefect artifacts, create markdown artifact. And we are going to go ahead and give this a run and explore what that artifact is going to look like in the Prefect Cloud UI. So kick this off. We can see that new flow run is created, Foamy Puffin. And if I refresh the page and try and see if I can find Foamy Puffin, what we should see is that there is a new weather report for us to take a look at. There's that report task that is responsible for generating the report. And if I click on that or the associated artifact, I will be able to see it in the dashboard. So there is our nice little weather report there. So pretty straightforward. If I wanted to change any of this information, all I would need to do is adjust the markdown. If I wanted to create an automation that lets me know whenever this flow run completes, then what I'll need to do is go to the automations page, create a new automation. This brings us to the form for creating the automation. As you can see here, there are a bunch of templates that you can pick and choose from. You can select email notification, trigger a deployment, which if you pick this one, what it will do is it'll basically trigger a flow run of a deployment in response to a trigger being met. So let's say if you wanted to trigger a downstream process in response to our fetch weather flow entering a failed state, you absolutely could do that. So you could either run the same deployment or you could run something that is completely different. Let's say we wanted to run our animal. Oh, I don't think I have a deployment for the animal fax flow. Okay. Atlantic weather deploy. Sure. Let's pick that one. And there is an option to pass in parameters to the input of the downstream flow run as well, which we will cover in more detail in a later module. But regardless, that's what this template offers. If you wanted to pick up another template, you certainly could. So you could do zombie runs. It's going to ask you if you want to change the template because it will basically take away all the work that you've done previously. But if you wanted to pick the zombie run, you absolutely could. This will clean up, well, zombie runs that are in non-terminal states for more than 24 hours. We can trigger a webhook with an automation, which we will cover in more detail in another module again. Or you could do something completely custom. In this case, let's just stick with the email notification because that's fairly simple. You would just want to fill out this information here. So let's say I want to make sure that anytime my fetch weather flow enters a state of completed, then I want to send an email. And with that, all you would need to do is click the little save button in the upper right-hand corner because your email is already populated down below. All right. Thank you so much for watching up until this point. I will catch you at the next one. Take care.